In 1957, a small boy's body was found in a cardboard box, abandoned and nameless. For decades, the world wondered who he was and why he was left to die alone. Then, in a twist no one saw coming, the discovery of a distant relative's DNA would reveal his true identity and a chilling secret about his death. The boy in the box would finally have a name, but the mystery of his killer still haunts us to this day. Before we unravel this chilling true crime story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on more shocking mysteries and unsolved cases. Now let's dive into the heartbreaking journey of the boy in the box. It was a frigid February morning in 1957 when an ordinary hunter's trip in the dense woods of Fox Chase, Philadelphia, turned into a moment that would haunt the city for decades. The man, weathered by years of outdoor adventures, had ventured into the quiet woodlands in search of game. His rifle slung over his shoulder, the hunter had no idea that today, fate would change the course of his life forever. He had wandered off the beaten path when something caught his eye, a scrap of cardboard barely visible through a thick patch of snow and underbrush. Curiosity piqued, he stepped closer. As he approached, the faint scent of decay hung in the air, but it wasn't until he reached the object that he realized the gravity of what lay before him. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned box, discarded carelessly in the wilderness. But when he lifted the lid, a wave of shock flooded over him. Inside was the body of a child. Wrapped in a threadbare blanket, the small figure looked peaceful, almost as though it were sleeping, but there was no mistaking the lifelessness of the child's body. The boy's face, though pale from exposure, appeared strangely untouched. His features were serene, even in death. His hair, neatly cut in a style that suggested care, seemed out of place against the grim backdrop of the scene. The small hands, though folded delicately at his side, bore signs of something more sinister. His wrists had been tied, an unsettling detail that seemed far too deliberate to ignore. The hunter stood frozen for a moment, disbelief slowly giving way to horror. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had found. Who was this boy? Why had he been left here in such an uncaring manner? The hunter quickly realized that this was no accident. Whoever had abandoned the child had meant for him to be found, alone and forgotten. Realizing the importance of his discovery, the hunter immediately called the authorities. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had begun to gather at the edge of the woods. Word of the gruesome find had spread quickly, and by the following day the story of the boy in the box made its way onto the front pages of newspapers across Philadelphia. The authorities, shaken by the horrific scene, immediately launched an investigation. The boy's body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where the somber task of uncovering his identity began. But there was one problem: the boy had no name. No missing persons report matched his description. There were no witnesses, no sign of struggle, and no immediate clues as to who he was or where he had come from. Despite the police's best efforts, the investigation quickly stalled. Theories and rumors began to circulate. Was the boy a victim of a troubled family, a child who had been abandoned by desperate parents, or was there something darker at play? The case baffled investigators. For weeks there were no leads. No parents or relatives came forward to claim him. No one recognized his face. His neatly cut hair suggested someone had once cared for him, but who? In the absence of answers, the boy's case began to fade into the background. The city moved on with its life, and the mystery of the boy in the box became just another unsolved tragedy. But the case lingered in the minds of the police officers and detectives who had worked on it. They couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the boy's story, a story that had yet to be told. As the years passed, the boy's case would grow cold, but his image would live on, haunting the city that had failed to uncover the truth. The boy in the box was forgotten by many, but for those who had worked tirelessly on his case, his name and his fate remained a ghost. The years after the discovery of the boy's body were marked by frustration and unanswered questions. The high investigation had hit a dead end, and though many theories surfaced, none seemed to bring the authorities any closer to solving the case. The boy in the box had become a shadow, his identity a puzzle that refused to be solved. The police tried everything they could think of to identify the child, They published his photo in the newspapers, hoping that someone might recognize his features. They released sketches and reconstructions based on forensic evidence, hoping a witness or someone from the child's past might come forward. But nothing. The community was left in the dark, and the boy was left to haunt the memories of those who had been touched by his tragic fate. The boy became an icon of the unknown. His image was everywhere, on posters, in public places, even in police stations. Every so often, detectives would revisit the case, hoping a fresh perspective would bring new insights. But as the years turned into decades, the boy's case grew colder. The boy became known as the boy in the box, a nameless victim of an unspeakable crime that seemed to have no answers. But time had a way of wearing down even the most determined. Officers who once worked on the case retired, and new investigators arrived, unaware of the significance of the case they were being handed. The case became a distant memory, a part of Philadelphia's dark history. The boy, once the focus of so much attention, became just another mystery in a city filled with them. But even as time wore on, the mystery never truly disappeared. It lingered like a fog that refused to dissipate. Every now and then, a new theory would emerge. Someone would suggest that the boy had been the victim of a human trafficking ring, or that his parents had been involved in a religious cult. Others claimed that the boy had been abandoned by a wealthy family, or that he had been the victim of a violent crime that left no trace. The possibilities were endless, but none of them held any real evidence. For years, the case sat in limbo. The boy's identity remained a mystery, his killers unknown. His story, though tragic, was one of many cold cases that haunted the city. And just as the case seemed to fade into oblivion, something unexpected happened, something that would change the entire course of the investigation. In 2022, a small group of genetic genealogists working on cold cases made a breakthrough that would send shockwaves through the investigative community. The boy in the box, whose identity had eluded investigators for over 6 decades, was finally identified through the power of DNA. The process was long and painstaking. DNA samples from the boy's remains had been stored for years, waiting for technology to catch up. The genetic genealogists, using the latest advancements in DNA analysis, began to trace the boy's ancestry. They worked tirelessly, searching through genealogical databases, connecting distant relatives and mapping out family trees. And then, after months of hard work, they found the key that unlocked the mystery. The boy's name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Joseph had been the secret love child of a wealthy family. His mother, desperate and fearful, had abandoned him in the woods. The forensic team discovered that his hands had been tied before his body was left in the box. This detail, once considered insignificant, now became a critical piece of the puzzle. Why had his hands been bound? Was it to keep him from escaping? Or was it an act of shame, fear? No one would ever know for sure. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Zarelli family, who had long been unaware of Joseph's existence. They had lived in silence, unaware of the tragic fate of the child who had once been part of their bloodline. For them, the discovery brought mixed emotions: relief at finally knowing his name, but pain and guilt over the secrets that had been hidden for so long. As the news spread, the city of Philadelphia was gripped by the revelation. The boy who had haunted the city for decades now had a name, a history, a family. His story, which had once been lost to time, was now being pieced together in front of the world. The police quickly issued a statement confirming the identity of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. They revealed that the boy had been born to a mother from a prominent, wealthy family, but the identity of his parents remained a closely guarded secret. The family had long since disbanded, and many of the key figures were either deceased or too old to provide answers. But one thing was clear: the case was far from over. While Joseph's identity was a monumental breakthrough, it opened up an entirely new set of questions. Who had abandoned him? Why had his mother, a member of a wealthy family, chosen to leave him in such a cruel manner? And most importantly, who had tied his hands before his death? Forensic experts quickly determined that Joseph had been around 4 years old at the time of his death. His neatly cut hair, the small size of his body, and the lack of any obvious wounds or signs of abuse painted a picture of a child who had once been cared for. But who had cared for him? Was it his mother, a nanny, a family member? As the investigation moved forward, the police focused their attention on Joseph's family. They hoped that the Zarelli family, now identified as the boy's relatives, might have some answers. But when they reached out, they found that the family had little to say. The Zarellis had a history of wealth and privilege, but their connection to Joseph was a well-kept secret. It seemed that even within the family, Joseph's existence had been carefully hidden from public knowledge. The mystery deepened. The investigators tried to track down any surviving relatives, hoping that someone might remember Joseph, or at least provide a clue as to his origins. But most of the family members who could have provided answers were either dead or unwilling to cooperate. The case had become even more complicated, and with each passing day the questions grew more haunting. Joseph's mother, once a young woman caught in a web of fear and shame, was now at the center of the investigation. Had she abandoned him out of desperation, or was there a darker motive behind her actions? The investigators believed that someone in the Zarelli family might know the answer. But as time went on, it became clear that finding the truth would not be as simple as uncovering Joseph's family tree. As the case surrounding Joseph Augustus Zarelli began to unravel, it was clear that many people had to have known the boy's story, yet no one had come forward. The silence was deafening. The Zarelli family, despite being the key to solving the mystery, remained largely uncooperative. Each new lead seemed to lead nowhere, and every door that was knocked on in the search for answers only opened to more questions. The boy's body, wrapped so carefully in a blanket and placed in a cardboard box, seemed to suggest an intimate knowledge of his vulnerability. There was no doubt now someone had made the deliberate choice to end his life and dispose of his body in the woods. The fear that must have gripped the person who left him there was palpable. But the question was why? Why was Joseph abandoned in such an impersonal way, in the cold winter woods, left for dead, like nothing more than trash? Despite the fact that Joseph's family was reluctant to cooperate with the investigation, a breakthrough came when investigators decided to look deeper into the background of those closest to the Zarelli family. As detectives scoured the past, they discovered a shocking revelation that hadn't occurred to them before. The Zarellis had a long history of controlling, manipulative behavior. A closer look at Joseph's mother, still an elusive figure, began to shed light on the dark family secrets. Forensic psychologists who were brought in to study the case started to believe that Joseph's mother might have been forced to hide the child to protect her reputation. In a family where outward appearances mattered more than anything else, an unacknowledged child, especially one born outside of wedlock, could ruin everything. Had the mother been pushed into a corner, isolated from those who might have offered support? Had she been coerced into abandoning him, fearing for her own life and social standing? Further research on the Zarelli family uncovered that the child had not been the first secret to be hidden away. There were other instances of mysterious disappearances and unexplained events within the family, many of which had been brushed aside, forgotten by the public. The deeper the detectives dug into the family's past, the more unsettling the connections became. In interviews with distant relatives, it was revealed that some Zarelli family members had been aware of a child existing in the background, though no one could confirm whether it was Joseph. Rumors of the child's existence had been passed along in hushed tones, and several family members, though not admitting outright guilt, seemed to know more than they were letting on. But there was no concrete evidence, and the silence from the most involved members of the family persisted. As the investigation into Joseph's origins continued, it became clear that there was a core group of people who likely knew the truth, but they were not speaking. The missing link remained elusive. With every new discovery, the case grew darker and more complex. And though it seemed that those closest to Joseph might have the answers, they remained determined to keep their secrets hidden. A new approach to the case came when the investigation team turned to the boy's remains for more clues. Joseph's body, despite being found in 1957, was remarkably well preserved, thanks to the cold weather and the careful way in which it had been wrapped. Forensic experts began to study the child's bones more closely. They paid special attention to the markings on his wrists, where they suspected that his hands had been bound before he was abandoned. Further analysis revealed more unsettling details. There was no sign of external wounds, but there were slight abrasions on his skin, suggesting that Joseph had been held against his will. A closer examination of his body revealed that he had been clean and well fed, pointing to the fact that he had been cared for at some point in his life. The absence of any clothing that matched the common attire of the time suggested that the boy had been dressed in a way that made him stand out, possibly to make it easier for someone to identify him, or perhaps to make a statement. Though Joseph's remains provided some answers, they also left many questions unanswered. The investigators discovered that Joseph's case was not unique. They found that there were other similar cases, children who had vanished without a trace and were left to die, with no one to claim them. Some cases had been resolved, while others remained as cold as the night Joseph had been left in the woods. At this stage, the search for answers became more urgent. Every lead was scrutinized, every piece of evidence weighed heavily in the balance. It was clear that Joseph's death was no accident, nor was it a random act of violence. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure his death was carried out, in a manner that would shield the perpetrator from any traceable guilt. The investigation team also focused their attention on the timeline leading up to the boy's abandonment. They began to piece together the history of the Zarelli family, looking for signs that someone within the family had been involved. As the detectives reviewed old family records and interviews with people close to the family, they began to uncover a pattern, an unsettling pattern that seemed to point to a much darker reality than they had ever imagined. The breakthrough came at a moment when the case seemed to be slipping into oblivion once again. It was during a routine review of old family records that one investigator, barely more than a rookie on the team, stumbled across an old letter. This letter, dated from the late 1950s, was written by a Zarelli family member who had been in contact with a woman believed to be Joseph's mother. The letter was filled with cryptic language, but one part stood out: "If the child is not dealt with, it will ruin us all." The implications of this letter were enormous. It suggested that Joseph's mother had not just abandoned him out of fear. She had been coerced into doing so. She had been caught in a trap, perhaps not of her making, and the pressure to conceal the child's existence had come from within the very family that should have been his protector. The investigators realized that this letter might be the key to understanding the deeper dynamics of the Zarelli family. Could it be that Joseph's mother had been forced to abandon him in order to protect the family name? Could the Zarellis, known for their wealth and status, have been involved in orchestrating the boy's death? The discovery of this letter created a sense of urgency in the investigation. The team knew they were nearing a pivotal moment. All the pieces were finally falling into place, but the final revelation still hung in the air, waiting to be uncovered. The letter discovered by the rookie investigator was just the beginning of a deeper journey into the Zarelli family's tangled past. It seemed that Joseph's abandonment was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader history of secrets, lies, and manipulation that stretched back for generations. The family, with its wealth and social influence, had always been able to bury the truth and maintain a facade of respectability. But now, with the investigation fully underway, the cracks in that facade began to show. As detectives sifted through family records, interviews, and even the long-forgotten personal papers of deceased relatives, the extent of the family's deceit became clear. Several members of the Zarelli clan had engaged in shady practices to maintain their wealth, ranging from questionable business dealings to affairs, financial scandals, and even ties to the criminal underworld. The family's reputation was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and it seemed that Joseph's birth had been a major thorn in that carefully constructed image. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that Joseph's life had likely been a liability for his mother, who was herself caught in the web of the family's secrets. The pressure on her to keep Joseph's existence hidden must have been overwhelming, The family's control over her was absolute, and the shame of having a child out of wedlock, especially one who could potentially inherit part of the family fortune, was too much to bear. For Joseph's mother, the only option was to abandon him, cast him aside like a piece of garbage, in hopes that the family would never find out. The discovery of these dark family secrets was devastating to Joseph's remaining relatives. Some had long suspected that the Zarelli name was built on a foundation of lies, but none had dared to confront the truth. Now, they were faced with the horrifying reality that the family's wealth and power had come at the cost of a child's life. And the person responsible for abandoning Joseph, a mother who had once cared for him, was, for all intents and purposes, invisible in the family's history. The deeper the investigation went, the more suspicious it became that someone inside, the family, or someone closely tied to the Zarellis, had played a role in Joseph's death. But the key players in this drama were either dead or unwilling to talk, leaving the detectives with a chilling realization. This case might never have a satisfactory conclusion. The truth was buried too deep. It wasn't until another unexpected discovery came to light that the investigators began to see the full picture. An anonymous tip led them to a key piece of evidence that had been overlooked for decades. A small, unmarked photograph that had been taken just weeks before Joseph's death. In the photograph, a young woman, whom the investigators now believed to be Joseph's mother, was seen walking down a quiet street in Philadelphia, holding hands with a man. The man's identity was unclear, but his presence in the photograph seemed to hold the key to understanding what had happened to Joseph. The photograph was crucial. It suggested that Joseph's mother had been in contact with someone, a person who might have been part of the family, or someone close to them, just before she made the decision to abandon her child. It also indicated that the abandonment had been premeditated, and that Joseph's mother was not alone in her actions. Someone had been with her, perhaps encouraging or coercing her to carry out the tragic act. Forensic experts enhanced the photograph, zooming in on the man's face. After much analysis and careful comparison, they were able to identify him as a member of the Zarelli family, though he had long since disappeared from public view. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. The man, a powerful figure within the Zarelli family, had been involved in a number of illicit activities over the years. Now it seemed that he was directly linked to Joseph's abandonment. But the mystery didn't end there. As investigators continued to dig into this family member's background, they uncovered a long history of manipulation, violence, and a disturbing obsession with secrecy. It seemed that this man, like many members of the Zarelli family, had gone to great lengths to protect his reputation and his wealth, no matter the cost. Joseph's life had been sacrificed to preserve the family's legacy. In interviews with former associates and family members, the investigators learned that the man in the photograph had been deeply involved in the decision to abandon Joseph. He had been the one to suggest that the child be discarded in such a brutal and heartless way, away from any prying eyes, hidden from the world. He had orchestrated the whole thing, using his influence over Joseph's mother to ensure that the child's death would remain a well-guarded secret. But as the truth emerged, so too did the consequences. The Zarelli family, once known for their power and wealth, was now a family in disarray. The truth about Joseph's death was out, and those responsible were no longer able to hide in the shadows. The family's legacy was tarnished beyond repair as the investigation came to a close. The question of justice remained unanswered. The primary person responsible for Joseph's abandonment had long since passed away, and the other members of the Zarelli family were too entrenched in their own webs of secrecy to face the consequences of their actions. But the impact of Joseph's story was far-reaching, far beyond the confines of the Zarelli family. The case, which had haunted Philadelphia for over 6 decades, was now closed. Joseph Augustus Zarelli had been identified, and the truth about his tragic death had been revealed. But justice, in the traditional sense, would never be served. The legal system could not hold the responsible parties accountable, and the Zarelli family would never publicly admit their guilt. The story, while tragic, had come to a bittersweet end. Joseph had finally been given a name, But the people who had caused his suffering would never truly face the consequences. As the investigation wrapped up, a memorial was held at the grave of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Though his family had abandoned him in life, the city of Philadelphia and the people who had followed his story would not forget him. Flowers were laid at his grave, and a plaque was placed to honor his memory. It was a quiet, somber ceremony, but it was one that spoke volumes about the strength of the human spirit and the desire for truth, no matter how long it took to uncover. The case of the boy in the box was no longer just a mystery. It was a story of survival, of unrelenting determination, and of the enduring quest for justice. Though Joseph's life had been cut short, his legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. His story had come full circle, not with a courtroom conviction, but with the knowledge that the truth had finally been told.